Our topic this evening is kind of the question, why was Jesus from Galilee? And so there's a couple of ways that we can look at that question, and we're going to tonight. In the first chapter of the Gospel of John, while Jesus is going around inviting people to follow him, so he's gathering disciples, one of his new disciples, Philip of Bethsaida, is immediately excited about the good news, about the gospel, and he himself begins spreading it. He evangelizes, and so he goes and finds a friend of his, or somebody anyway, named Nathanael, a person who doesn't otherwise appear in any of the gospel accounts, but anyway is here in two mentions at the beginning and at the end of the Gospel of John. And Philip says to Nathanael, look, we've found the one about whom Moses wrote about in the law. So here's the guy that has been prophesied in the Torah and about whom the prophets also wrote. It's Jesus of Nazareth, the son of Joseph. Wow, okay. Nathanael's response to this news is, Nazareth? Can anything good come from there? And Philip replies, well, come and see. So I think this is the author of John's kind of apologetic for the criticism that I think early Christians, as when Christianity begins, it's a Jewish sect. And so Jews who have become Christians are going around and they're talking to their friends who are also Jews. They're not Christians. And I think this is a common thing that may have been happening. So a lot of things that occur in John's gospel, they are obviously, all of the texts are always written from the context of the evangelist. So it is not written, it's theoretically set in Jesus' day, but what the author himself knows is his own present day context. And so this is essentially, I think, the kind of thing that Jews, other non-Christian Jews, are telling the members of the John community as they're going around and saying, hey, you know who fulfills all of the prophecies about the Messiah in the Torah and in the prophets? It's Jesus of Nazareth. And the people respond, wait a second. When I read the prophecies, I remember something about the Messiah supposed to be from Bethlehem. He's not supposed to be from Nazareth, right? So I think that this is, like I say, an apologetic response to questions that non-Christians are having when they're hearing about this news. So tonight we're going to look a little bit at Galilee and think about Galilee as a little bit of a unique location and kind of an interesting location for Jesus' movement to have originated in and Jesus himself to have originated in. So we're very familiar, we think of this ancient area, we think about Judea, and we maybe call the whole thing Judea sometimes, or we call it the whole thing Palestine, or we call it Lesser Syria, or sometimes we just say the Holy Land so that we can avoid naming it any one thing. But essentially this is the area of the Levant between Egypt and Mesopotamia, and it's the smaller or lesser part of it, with the greater part of it being greater Syria, centered on Damascus and above Antioch and so forth. And so anyway, this area, the area immediately around Jerusalem is Judea, and then the area kind of to the west of the Sea of Galilee, sometimes also called Lake Tiberias here, is Galilee. And in between that is Samaria on the one hand, and also in the time of Jesus, this area that is called the Decapolis, and we'll explain that. So whenever I first saw, like, let's say this map growing up as a kid in the back of a Bible, a study Bible, and I had maps of the Holy Land. I loved maps from early childhood, and I became I drew all kinds of maps, and real maps, historical maps, fantasy maps, and ultimately went in and became a professional map maker as one of the jobs that I've had in life. So designing maps for history museums and also for university presses and so forth. And so one of the things going back to my earliest experience with looking at historical atlases at the back of a study Bible when I was a kid, I would see these breakdowns, and these territories don't really make a lot of sense if you're thinking about it from, let's say, a defensive idea. If this was like if you're playing Risk, this is not a defensible position. And so, for example, in Jesus' day, for some reason, as it kind of says in the little map in the insert here, Herod Antipas, one of Herod's sons, one of his successors, who is the tetrarch of one of these territories, he is ruler over Galilee, which is that kind of discrete area, but also the Perea, which is that green area here. And so, in other words, two completely disconnected spaces. And indeed, like things like the Decapolis, these are almost, we're only seeing some of them here. There's more of them. Damascus is one of the cities, one of the 10 cities. Decapolis means, in Greek, 10 cities. And essentially, these are kind of 10 city-states that have their own sort of territory, that they're not under the sway of any of these other little tiny provinces and so forth. So in other words, how do all these all fit together? And so the answer to that is that none of these places is truly independent at this point or at the time of Jesus. All of this stuff for a century almost has all been under Roman dominion. So nominally, or in terms of being able to handle your own local affairs nominally, the places like sometimes Samaria and Judea, and certainly at the time of Jesus here, Galilee and the Perea, these are client states, and so their foreign policy, their defense, their military, that is all controlled by the Roman Empire. But the internal government and so forth is still being run by a local Jewish king, or not a king in this case, a Jewish leader who has the lesser title of tetrarch. And so anyway, that's kind of how it is. And you can kind of see then these major areas on the bigger map here: Judea, Samaria, Galilee, Perea, Decapolis, and then there's this broader area that's just called Syro-Phoenicia, which is to say the part of Roman Phoenicia and Roman Syria, where they're all speaking Aramaic and sometimes Greek, that has all been previously been part of the Seleucid Empire that has now been annexed directly by the Romans. And so that's why this is such a strange little hodgepodge of states. So each of the Decapolis city-states is essentially, they're dependent on Rome, so they're not independent, but they are pretty much don't have to do what anybody in Galilee or Samaria or somewhere else is saying, that kind of thing. And this is just a little bit of a zoom in, and so you can see, I don't know, the scale here is maybe too tiny here, but at the very top, across the whole width of that scale is just 40 miles, and what is that, 60, a little over 60 kilometers, and so the whole distance here from the center of Galilee to Jerusalem is a little more than an hour's drive if you had a good road and a car, which they didn't back then. But in other words, this is not a big territory. And so one of the things, again, when it's just a disembodied map that I'm reading as a kid in the back, I had no idea really how small all of these territories are. So the territory in this land is not big, and it really, largely throughout most of history, in a political sense, has never been important. It's always been a frontier zone between bigger and more important places. And so specifically Lesser Syria down here is at the minimum just a periphery of the greater area of Syria, but even all of Greater Syria, which is to say the area between Egypt and Mesopotamia, that's just a frontier zone sort of between bigger states like Egypt and Mesopotamia, or Egypt and Anatolia, Turkey, and so forth. And so anyway, what these are not, these are not bases that are themselves the center. So I want to do just a brief history of Galilee to set the context. So the Hebrew Bible, by which I mean in the Christian sense, the Old Testament, includes the area of Galilee, and it says it's among the inhabited lands that are inhabited or owned by Israelite tribes. And the Hebrew Bible further says or divides it between the tribes of Zebulun, Issachar, and Naphtali. And as early, though, as this period, so in other words, dating back to the time period of the First Temple period, the region of Galilee had a reputation for being ethnically mixed. So we read in Isaiah 9:1, Isaiah speaks of Galilee of the Gentiles or Galilee of the nations. And so the idea is that there are more diverse people here than just Israelites. And in any event, the area of the tribes as described in the Old Testament in any event is more aspirational than real. There's always massive intermixing between the Israelite tribes and all of their neighbors, because in fact most historians and archaeologists now sort of agree that the Israelite tribes, emerge from the broader Canaanite population, or indeed simply a component of them. People who are differentiating themselves from their neighbors, but are in fact have the same ethnic origin as their neighbors. So in other words, there's Canaanites all around, and the main difference is between them is whether or not you have adopted the Yahwist religion, the centralizing religion of the God of Israel, or whether you are having a broader pantheon of gods, Baal and so forth, what we kind of broadly or shorthand call essentially the polytheists or the pagans, who ethnically are speaking the same language and having a very similar customs and even very similar temples and so forth, but nevertheless have, are said to be different because they're not part of this centralizing religion. First Kings also, tells a story anyway that King Solomon, who's not likely a historical figure, but anyway, King Solomon gave the king of Tyre, according to the text, 20 cities in the land of Galilee. And so that may refer, even if that's not a historical story, that may still refer to an understanding or an explanation for somebody who's writing the book at the time, why the Phoenicians own some of the lands or some of the towns or cities in the Galilee area seem to be more Phoenician than Israelite and so forth. So in other words, there's some indications already in the Old Testament period that this area is seen as more mixed by the Israelites themselves. Before and after the Assyrian conquest, so the area of Galilee is part of, in the monarchical period, the area of Galilee is in the hinterland of the northern kingdom of Israel, so prior to its conquest in 721 BCE by the Assyrians. And so as we've seen before when we've done the history of this period, the northern kingdom is the original kingdom and the more important Israelite center. And it's centered on the tribes of Manasseh and Ephraim, and the capitals at Samaria and Shechem and so forth. And it is really only when this kingdom gets destroyed by the Assyrians that the southern kingdom of Judah really emerges and comes into its own kind of glory age, which is that period between the destruction of the lost 10 tribes, of the northern 10 tribes, and the destruction of Jerusalem by the Babylonians. And so it's in that time period that Jerusalem suddenly goes from being kind of a little hill town, the center of a tribal chieftainate, to actually being its own little Iron Age kingdom in its own right. And it has this flowering of prophetic literature and other literature that later gets edited together into what we have as the Bible during the exile period and immediately after the exile. So the Assyrians, from the northern kingdom export the elite, so the nobles and the merchant class and the military class and so forth, and they take them to Mesopotamia, to near the Assyrian heartland. And as part of the regular Assyrian practice, so you take people out of their local network and you put them on your other side of your frontier, so that they don't have any roots, and so they now become loyal to the Assyrian Empire because they don't have any other real choice. They can't easily rebel and be in their own homeland and so forth. And they took other peoples from around the other frontiers, and they brought them to Israel and settled them in Galilee and Samaria. So while Samaria nevertheless retained its Israelite character, so that had been the center of the kingdom, and not everybody got deported, and so there continued to be people who are following the Yahweh religion, and they are continuing to have a temple in Shechem and Samaria, in Samaria is where it is, and on Mount Gerizim anyway, and they are continuing to maintain that identity. But it may be that the hinterland, the northern hinterland north of Samaria, Galilee, may have lost its Israelite character and more completely assimilated into the Assyrian and later Babylonian provincial status. And slowly, over the course of then this next long period of time, when the land here is provinces of these empires, first the Assyrians, then the Babylonians, and then the Persians, people stop speaking Hebrew, and instead they start speaking Aramaic, which is the lingua franca of the Aramites, Aram, Damascus, the Syrians, in other words. And so that becomes the main language of this whole territory, and people start speaking Aramaic. So at this point, during the conquest, Galilee kind of temporarily falls out of the story, and it's hard to even find any maps. So I have a map here of just the province of Judah, which is called Yehud in the Persian period, and you can see it's contracted to the point where it's only the only thing that the exiles have charge of is Jerusalem and more or less the immediate area around Jerusalem. And again, there is another province of the Persian Empire, Samaria, which is centered on the city of Samaria, the old northern capital. And then there's another province that will be above that of Galilee, but the province of Galilee at this point is very sparsely populated. And like I say, it may have largely now been assimilated into the general Syro-Phoenician population. So although the Judean exiles were allowed to return home after the Persians conquered the Babylonians, like I say, the province of Yehud only included the area around Jerusalem. The exiles, the Jewish people who came back, the Judeans who came back from Babylon, the elites that were taken there by the Babylonians, when they returned, the people who had stayed, the people who were now the leaders of the Persian province of Samaria, they said, hey, we want to help out. We can help you rebuild your temple too. We're glad to have you back, and so forth. But the exiles are like, no, you guys are not, you haven't kept to the pure ways the way we understand them. Part of their arguments is a very partisan argument. They're saying that because so many non-Israelite people were settled in the territory by the Assyrians, that you no longer have a pure bloodline and so forth. I think we shouldn't credit that as a legitimate argument. That is the partisan argument of the exiles. The Samaritans have their own, or Sumerians, later we call them Samaritans, have their own perspective on that. And a counter argument could be made, well, the exiles also assimilated while they were in Babylon. They stopped using their language. They started speaking Aramaic. Even the Davidic representative, the Davidic prince, even has an Aramaic name, Zerubbabel, which means that he's child of Babylon. And so, it's kind of the pot calling the kettle black in terms of that. But that's the partisan rhetoric against the Samaritans. But in any event, this is a time period they will have separated because they will have had a very different cultural experience, the one being in Babylon and the other one starting from a different place in the northern kingdom anyway. And the exiles bring back with them something new, which is an edited book of law, the Torah, and so forth. So they become focused now on the Bible. Samaritans later have their own Torah, but it doesn't seem to have been something that they maintained as a separate lineage. It's something that they have adopted in imitation of the Judeans. After Alexander conquers the Persian Empire, the provinces of Judea, Samaria, and Galilee were on the border between the Seleucid and Ptolemaic Hellenistic kingdoms. So Alexander is this great conqueror from Macedon. He is essentially, he's been tutored by Aristotle, and he wants to bring all of these Greek ideas and impose them on everybody around the world. And so that's why we call these kingdoms Hellenistic. And so one of the things that happens during these following centuries is that Greek and Greek ideas, Greek philosophy, Greek institutions, Greek focus on cities, all of that gets spread. And so Alexander likes to found new cities like Alexandria in Egypt, but there's actually dozens of cities that he founds, and he names them after himself, Alexandria, this and that place, and so forth. And so often what happens is that old cities get refounded as new Greek cities, and they adopt all of this new Greek cosmopolitan stuff. And so one of the cities here on the border here, the cities that become the Decapolis, things like Scythopolis and Pella and so forth, these become new Greek cities, and that's how there is this whole Decapolis ultimately of Greek pagan cities between Galilee and Samaria. As those Hellenistic empires collapsed, as the successors to Alexander, the Seleucids in Syria, the Ptolemies in Egypt, as their power waned, then the border states between them were able to, the cats are away, the mice will play. So as we've seen in our lecture on the Maccabees, very briefly, the Judeans were able to assert a Judean state. And while that was happening, their leaders, the kings, which are called the Hasmoneans or the Maccabees, they were able to conquer Samaria and ultimately conquer Galilee as well. So during the relatively brief rule of the Hasmoneans, they destroyed the Samaritan temple. They don't like the Samaritans, and you can see this rivalry is pretty intense. And they may have, when they conquered both Galilee, which is to the north of Samaria, and also Idumea, what we call in the Old Testament Edom, when they conquered those two territories, they seem to have forced conversions, so forced the Idumeans and the Galileans to convert to Judaism. The Samaritans would have refused, so whatever they as much as they might have tried. And so they had their own separate things. So the Galileans and the Idumeans had probably been some kind of pagans, and now there are indications anyway that they're converted, and we presume therefore that it was a forced conversion, but it's not clear if it's forced or not. But in any event, it's a fast conversion, and people they're joined. The people in Galilee are joined to the faith by the bond of circumcision. So we don't know if they forced everybody to get circumcised or how they did it, but there is some anyway imposition of Judaism on these new territories. And so from this time onward, Galilee, which had been kind of mostly depopulated because of it had been a war zone and so forth, is sort of actively resettled by Jews, so surplus population coming out of Judea, but maybe also diaspora Jews coming back in and finding good lands and so forth. And so that gives Galilee a mixed population, both ethnically and religiously. There will be kind of the underlying people that have always been there that are speaking some kind of speaking Aramaic, and they may have had a Syro-Phoenician Canaanite kind of paganism that is their religious activity. Now there's several of them have been converted. Some of them have been converted. There's also been new settlers that have been implanted there that are all Jewish. And then on top of that, there's also the various, especially elites, who have in different cities that are Greek speakers and are Greek-speaking pagans. There'd be a couple Samaritans here and there, but they'll mostly be concentrated in Samaria. So during the lifetime of Jesus then, as I said, Jesus is ruled by Herod Antipas, so one of Herod, the great successors, who is ruling as a tetrarch the area of Galilee and Perea. And one of the things that he does is build large kind of Greek capitals, Greek cities that are capitals for his territory. One of them, Sepphoris, he refounds a city called Sepphoris, which is right next to Nazareth. And then he builds a city called Tiberias on the lake, the Sea of Galilee, which is renamed Lake Tiberias after, in honor of the emperor. So the primary language, as I say, for the peasantry was likely Aramaic, with a bunch of Greek speakers in the cities. The religion would have been mixed between local Aramaic-speaking pagans, Greek pagans, and then also Jews. Within these, you can kind of see on this map of Galilee, Nazareth is a village. There's maybe 1,500 people. It's just a few miles from Sepphoris, that new capital Herod Antipas is refounding, where many of the local peasants then from Nazareth may have actually found work. So there's a big building project. According to the Gospels, Jesus' family and himself even are woodsmiths, carpenters, and so they may have actually gone and found work in part of these whole big projects that are there, because they would not have been too far away from that city and all of the jobs and public expenditure that would have been available there. So that a little bit of a background. I want to talk a little bit about the differences here between the Christ of theology, the Jesuses of Scripture, and the historical Jesus. So the gospel accounts in the Christian canon in the New Testament, the four gospels of Jesus, as we know, are written by anonymous Greek-speaking Christians who were not eyewitnesses of Jesus. They depict, therefore, the Jesus of Scripture, not the historical Jesus. Their stories are based on their testimony of the risen Christ, which is the Christian understanding of God, the Christ of theology. Visions of the risen Christ originally were inspired by the earlier life of the historical Jesus of Nazareth. And so there's some memory of that historical figure that is embedded in all of this. And I want to show this, how this all kind of can be seen, maybe even just in terms of this symbolic painting of Jesus as fully human and fully divine. This is a very ancient icon from the monastery on Mount Sinai, I think from the 6th century here. So a picture of Jesus as Christ Pantocrator. And so if we take the left half of this image, as we see it, and we mirror it, we get the image on the left. And if we take the right half and mirror it, we get the image on the right. So we can see that the image is very deliberately painted with two halves. In other words, the monks here, or the artist, is trying to make a very symbolic representation of Jesus. It's not a historical representation of Jesus in any way. We have no idea of, we don't have any description or any images that date to the historical Jesus. And so this is with even lacking those though, artists have not felt like, oh, well, since we don't know what Jesus looks like, we can't make any pictures of him. No, they felt quite able to make pictures of him. And in a lot of cases, they are pictures that are filled with religious symbolism like this one. And so what the monks here are saying, they're Nicene Christians who are, like most modern Christians, are Nicene Christians who assert that Christ is fully human and fully divine. And so that's represented here very obviously in this picture. So while the Gospels preserve some details about the historical picture, like that portrait, their purpose is theological and not historical. And so we have to use the academic disciplines of history and literary criticism and to some extent archaeology to reconstruct the historical Jesus. There's lots and lots of Christians who want to know, okay, but what in the Bible is history and what isn't? And I think that this shouldn't be anybody's concern, really. And as a rule of thumb, Christians should just begin with the base assumption that any given event in the Bible is not historical. That's not the point of it in any event. And so scholarly consensus on it is that we can only include a few details, or in other words, to make into the scholarly consensus, only a very few of the details of the life of the historical Jesus can be kind of confirmed that everybody agrees happened beyond his existence. And so even some people question his existence, but that is really an outlier, a fringe view that, in my opinion, is actually kind of a little bit outside of scholarship. So it's not widely held anyway among scholars or held by many at all. So here's the bare bones consensus. So most scholars agree concerning the historical Jesus that he was one from Nazareth, that he was baptized by a popular leader known as John the Baptist, that he gathered and taught his own group of disciples in sort of a mendicant spiritual group, a group that was not interested in property, but was interested in begging for their daily bread, give us this day our daily bread, and is against giving, selling everything and giving it to the poor and so forth. He built a reputation as a faith healer, and he was crucified by the Roman government in Jerusalem. So how do we get to the consensus to establish historical details? So that one, I just mentioned those as stuff that everybody agrees on. That's not the only things that people think are historical, but once you get past kind of that foundation, you now have to weigh all of the evidence, look at all the sources, think about all of the different biases and so forth, in order to assert your own argument about and to create a portrait of what the historical Jesus is like. And so some of the criteria that we use to establish historical details are things like multiple attestation. So do we find this detail in multiple unique sources? So does it only exist in one gospel, so in other words, we don't hear about this any other place than in the Gospel of Matthew. Well, that's not multiple attestation then. You might think it sounds a lot like the way you imagine Jesus to be, but it's not supported by multiple attestation. It doesn't mean that it isn't historical, but it means that we don't have that as a buttress to assert its historicity. Better still is when these sources have contrasting viewpoints and contrasting biases. And so, anything that we can say, well, we have a little bit of an archaeological record here, or the Jewish source says this, or the Roman source says this. In other words, it's not, or let's say, two contrasting Christian groups that don't have the same ultimate views, and they both agree about this one thing, even though they don't like each other. So if there's those kind of things, then we have, again, a broader based multiple attestation. So multiple attestation. So 2, is it contrary to the later Christian understanding of Jesus? This seems almost pernicious to Christians as they hear this. So if anything that Jesus is doing sounds too Christian, that weighs against him, against it. It doesn't mean that he didn't do things like that, but why doesn't that help identifying historicity? It's because later Christians, that's their understanding. And so as they're writing later sources, they're more likely to say that that's how things were, whether or not they have any evidence for it, whether or not there's any tradition. And they also can be, just because of their memory and their oral tradition, they can be evolving the tradition so that it fits their present experience. And so if instead the source is talking about something that is just completely unknown in later Christianity, well, that's weird. And why would a Christian invent that then? And so therefore, it's more likely to be authentic in that way. Another one is the criterion of embarrassment. So if it's something that there's no reason Christians would want to invent that because they're later embarrassed about it and try to have a bunch of apologetics to explain that away. So for example, there's embedded in the Gospels, there's critiques of Jesus that he doesn't fast and that he's maybe eating and drinking too much, unlike ascetics like John the Baptist had been. And so Jesus in the Gospels has to say, well, there'll be time to fast when I'm gone and so forth. This is not the time for fasting or something like that. And so why is that? So maybe that is something that the historical Jesus was doing and saying, but it also may be that the later Christians are trying to explain why he has this criticism for not being an ascetic. So in other words, not fulfilling that the way many spiritual leaders and monk-like people would be doing. Finally, also, everything has to kind of also be consistent with the rest of the historical record. So does this fit into the rest of what we know about the historical context? Is there some kind of an anachronism where this idea or this thing that they're talking about couldn't have occurred in the time frame that it's portrayed? So, for example, we know how later Christian church develops with having deacons or something like that. If Jesus is talking to a deacon or something, that would be like an anachronism because it wouldn't fit. Or Jesus is going around talking about the Jews. Well, Jesus was a Jew, and he wouldn't ever have called anybody the Jews. There isn't a separate group. That's an anachronism that's dating from the fact that the later Christians who are writing that now consider themselves to be a separate group from other Jews, who they can now call the Jews, and so forth. Okay, so how do we establish then? I mentioned Jesus' baptism by John as one of those kind of bedrock events. So it's established really by all of these criteria. Baptism, which is the Greek word for washing or dipping, it fits into that broader historical context. So many Second Temple Jewish groups had a religious practice of bathing to achieve ritual purity, mikveh bathing. So we've got here a picture of archaeological remains of a mikveh bath at Qumran, this community where it's this quasi-monastic community where the Dead Sea Scrolls were housed. These essentially were a sect of people living priest-like purity, and part of the purity rituals of the Old Testament law are that for certain things, if you encounter certain things, you have to have a ritual bath, and the bath has to have special properties. In other words, drawn from living water and so forth. You can't turn on a tap and make it happen. And so as a result of that, these were difficult to make. They are often a desert and so forth. They had to create an aqueduct in order to make this thing happen. But the water isn't about real washing or really clean, because the water probably at a certain point after all of the bathing would not have been very clean and so forth. In sanitary terms, it's ritual terms. So John the Baptist's practice, as described in the Gospels, is different. But it would be essentially building on an existing practice and changing it so that it has a new spiritual interpretation, and that could easily be an innovation by a leader like somebody like John. So essentially, it's in the historical context. It's not something in a way that later Christians would invent, because although baptism becomes a Christian initiation rite, the Gospels don't actually have Jesus going around instituting that or baptizing anybody. In the Gospel accounts, John is the one who is baptizing people for the remission of sins, not to take on them the name of Christ or anything like that the later Christian baptism is really about. The remission of sins continues in the Christian understanding of it, but it's not this initiation. And even though there's sort of a reference in the Gospel of John that the only reference to Jesus baptizing, it says Jesus and his disciples were baptizing, it later says it was really only it's only the disciples, not Jesus, who are baptizing. So the Gospels are actually even kind of making it clear that Jesus is not doing the baptizing. So it's a strange thing to have done in terms of the later Christian, if it's an invention, in terms of the later Christian practice. There's also a lot of multiple attestation. All of the Gospel records are aware of Jesus' baptism by John, and several of them record it. But we'll talk about how several of them sort of try to mask it. So Mark, the first narrative gospel to be composed sometime around when the Romans destroy the Second Temple in the year 70. It actually begins with the baptism story. So this is the evangelist who wrote the Gospel of Mark, kind of sees this as the most important moment beginning of Jesus' ministry. The Gospels also indicate that John the Baptist has his own disciples that are separate from Jesus' disciples, and thus his own movement. And him being the leader of a movement is sort of confirmed by Josephus in Josephus's passage on John, and so that's an outside, non-Christian, Jewish Roman source. And although it's not an early source, because there's no early source that can date this back to it, it may be that, as we've seen in our lecture on John the Baptist, that John's disciples, their movement may survive as the Mandaeans, which is a threatened Middle Eastern religion. There's also a lot of Christian embarrassment, so the criterion of embarrassment about the baptism story. The story is supported because the historicity of the story is supported by the fact that Christian concerns had a lot of potential for this embarrassment. The story shows, John is doing the baptism. So it shows John in a position of authority. He's baptizing his followers, and he's also baptizing Jesus. And so it's an obvious question after you hear the story is, well, wait a second. Is he the guy in authority? Was it John? Was Jesus John's disciple? And so that was a concern that even the evangelists who are writing the Gospels have. Also, John's spiritual practice of baptism is for the remission of sins. In other words, it's not ritual purity like the mikveh bathing of the Essenes and the other Jewish sects, the traditional Jewish ritual bathing. And so wait a second. In Christian theology, didn't Jesus live a sinless life? As Christians later understood that. Does he have any sins to wash away? So that is another potential counter-argument or a point of embarrassment for people reading the story. So there's already apologetic answers to that in Mark. So Mark's account of the baptism puts into John's mouth, after me, John the Baptist says, comes the one more powerful than I, the straps of whose sandals I am not worthy to stoop down and untie. So that answers that authority question. Mark has read that and is worried that somebody will come to that conclusion, and whether he's heard before some other Christians say that John had said that or not, that is an answer to that authority question. So as far as the Christians are going to say, no, John was very clear that Jesus has the authority. So that's an apologetic answer. And Mark also equates John with a prophecy in Isaiah 40 verse 3, which defines his whole role as being a forerunner of Jesus. So we don't have this idea, it must be very clear, he's not the original guy and Jesus is the disciple and so forth. He's simply a guy who is predicting that Jesus was going to show up. And that becomes the Christian conception of John. But we're getting the Christian partisan perspective only. So in other words, if we had sources from John's disciples, which we don't, they would probably have a different perspective or the counter-argument. So the author of Matthew used Mark as a source, and he likes Mark's apologetics, but he doesn't think it's gone far enough. So Matthew has John say to Jesus, wait, I need to be baptized by you, and you come to me? So he even adds a further length of this. I don't, not only do I not have authority, you should be the one baptizing me, as a counter-argument again that shows that John doesn't have the authority here. So this is an apologetic. Also, Matthew also creates an apologetic to explain why a sinless Jesus needs to do the baptism. So according to Matthew, Jesus says, well, it's proper for us to do this in order to fulfill all righteousness. So now we have an example. Well, yeah, sure, he's sinless anyway, so it's not going to do anything in terms of remission of sins, but it's just a model to fulfill all righteousness and to show everybody else that they should do it, kind of a thing. So that's how they answer that argument. The author of Luke, who is working also with Mark as a source, but totally independently from the author of Matthew, so doesn't know what Matthew's writing, kind of around the same time. The author of Luke is obviously even more distressed by the story, and so Luke's text actually changes Mark's original. And originally it says, Jesus was baptized by John, and in Luke's text it goes, Jesus was baptized too. So it doesn't say who baptized him or anything like that. And that is removed from the original part of the story where John is hanging out, and instead Luke inserts that John the Baptist is arrested by Herod Antipas and puts that before saying Jesus was baptized too. So that actually separates John out from any potential kind of from baptizing him. It's not clear. Luke isn't really saying that John wasn't the one that baptized Jesus, but is creating a lot of ambiguity there. So Luke does not want to admit that John the Baptist baptized Jesus for these embarrassing reasons of authority. There's even more extreme apologetics in the Gospel of John, which, as we've seen, is totally unrelated to John the Baptist. Lots of people are named John. And so John, the Gospel of John, the fourth Gospel, represents a separate tradition from the synoptics. So as we saw, Matthew and Luke are very related to Mark because they're using Mark as a source. John is not directly working from Mark as a source. It's a separate tradition. And so it's the last composed and also probably the least historical gospel. So there's, I think, most historians of the historical Jesus don't use much from the Gospel of John in terms of any of those details actually happen, but rather only when they are multiply attesting something else that happens, then it's useful because it's an independent source from the others. So in the Gospel of John, John the Baptist is still at the beginning of the Gospel, but he's mostly there to deny that he's the Messiah or Elijah or a prophet. So people come and say, wait a second, are you the Messiah? Are you a prophet? He says, no, I'm not any of those things. So he really is, arguing against his own authority. He's not even Elijah, the forerunner who's coming before Jesus. He's saying, no, he's really only here to testify that Jesus is the Messiah. And John the Baptist does see the vision of the Spirit descending like a dove on Jesus, which is something that occurs in the other Gospels. So in other words, a very famous image of the baptism of Jesus. But Jesus' baptism in the Gospel here is not mentioned at all. So the vision takes place, but if you were only reading the Gospel of John, you wouldn't know that was taking place because Jesus is being baptized, because that baptism is not mentioned. So that eliminates both the authority question problem and also why would a sinless guy need to be baptized problem. So in other words, those events fit our criteria. First of these we looked at as Jesus' baptism by John. Let's also just briefly look at why Jesus' execution by the Romans is also fitting all of our historical criteria. So again, for the crucifixion, we have multiple attestation. Actually, we have way more attestation. It's a rare source in the Roman source in the historian Tacitus, writing in the early 2nd century. And he says, Christus, or Christ, from whom the name of the sect, Christians, had its origin, suffered the extreme penalty during the reign of Tiberius at the hands of one of our procurators, Pontius Pilate, and a most mischievous superstition, thus checked for the moment, in other words, his leaders checked, again broke out not only in Judea, the first source of the evil, but even in Rome, where all things hideous and shameful from every part of the world find their center and become popular. So he's explaining why there are people who are part of this superstitious, mischievous cult, as far as he's concerned, and are in the city of Rome. And it's because even though there was a guy who was the founder, a guy named Christ, as far as Tacitus is concerned, from whom they all call themselves after them, Christians, that these Christians, that guy was executed way back in Tiberius's reign, and yet this thing keeps spreading. So execution by Pilate is also mentioned in Josephus, as we saw in our Josephus lecture, although, as we also described, the text of that passage has been contaminated by later Christian interpolation. So, crucifixion also fits within the regular historical context in the Roman Empire. It's a very common form of execution employed by the Romans. They do it when they want to make an example out of the victim. So, for example, in the case of a slave revolt, the Spartacus revolt, they line the Via Appia with just thousands of crosses, and they crucify all of the slaves that they captured who revolted against Roman authority. They'll also crucify individual slaves who kill their masters and so forth. Brigands. So one of the things that happens, there's no police force in the Roman Empire. And a lot of times when an area falls into a recession or something like that, people are in hard times, and they more or less form gangs of thieves and robbers, and they become people who extort people on the roads and things like that. So brigands, they'll crucify them. Same thing on the water, pirates, and just other perceived rebels, so troublemakers. So for example, we don't know if we'd have to look at each one of these things and decide whether we consider there to be historical events, but in the gospel narratives, Jesus enters into Jerusalem during the Passover to a big, essentially triumphal celebration kind of thing on Palm Sunday. That causes a big disturbance, and it could seem that he is proclaiming himself to be a Messiah or a king. In so doing, if that is a historical event, that would have attracted Roman attention. Another event that is talked about in the gospel accounts is overturning the tables of the marketplace inside the temple in Jerusalem. That also is something you could get arrested for and maybe crucified for, in other words, as it's a revolutionary sort of thing. So there were plenty of things that the Romans might have, just being the head of a movement, doesn't necessarily even have to do anything particularly obnoxious. The Romans potentially could go crucify them to just keep the peace. There is also the criterion of embarrassment for the crucifixion. So most Jews in the Second Temple period had no expectation that the Messiah, or as we say in Greek, the Christ, would be executed. There was an expectation that a Messiah, a Savior, was going to come, but the prophecies don't say, oh, he's going to be crucified or something like that. And in fact, this would have been a strong counter-argument that proved to most Jews that Jesus was not the Messiah, was not the Christ. So the method of execution here that the Romans are using, it's a very shameful way to die in the way the Romans are thinking, and it's also, according to Jewish law, a very shameful way to die. So Deuteronomy says that those hung on a tree are cursed, and this is also the fate for, let's say, the worst villains in biblical mythology. So Haman, the terrible traitor that is trying to have all of the Jews in the Persian Empire executed, when his plot is exposed and he gets his comeuppance and everything like that, he's hung on a tree. And so, anyway, this is a really shameful, cursed way to have died. Nevertheless, there is attestation across all the Christian sources. Paul, who is our earliest Christian whose writings have survived, because he's converted after Jesus' death, and because his personal faith is focused on the risen Christ, even though he's an extensive writer, his writings actually talk very little about the historical Jesus, but the major exception is the crucifixion, which for Paul is essential in order for Christ to have conquered death through resurrection. In other words, he had to be killed in order to conquer death, be resurrected, and that's really at the core of Paul's understanding of the Christian faith, so he talks about it a lot. Nevertheless, in the story of the crucifixion, the later details, so was Jesus crucified by the Romans? Yes. But we have apologetic evolution of the story already at the foundational layer of the gospel accounts. So the details of the Passion story in John and the Synoptics actually kind of track more closely than in the rest of the details of Jesus' ministry. I mentioned how John is often very, very different from the other three Gospels. For example, Jesus doesn't ever teach in parables, and that's kind of one of his main things in the rest of the Gospels. There's just a very different order of events. The overturning of the money changers happens really early in the Gospel of John and so forth. So it's a different order, it's completely different events. The resurrection of Lazarus and other things that occur only in John, not in the other Gospels. You'd think, why wouldn't they have mentioned that, and so forth. And so they're very different, but they track very closely when we get to the Passion story, which is to say the Easter story leading up to the crucifixion of Jesus and so forth. And so there may have been an underlying Christian apologetic, some kind of lost passion gospel, or just a strong tradition that was developing. Or it's possible that John is indirectly reacting to Mark, so it's not directly based on Mark, but John either has heard that part of the Markan story a bunch of times and is reacting to it. I don't know. So already in Mark, there are signs, though, that the story has evolved to incorporate Christian apologetics. And I'm going to make a little example of how this hypothetically could go. And I'm not suggesting here, actually, that it would be like in my cartoon where this is happening in real time. This is happening over the course of 40 years. and so there are complaints and then responses. And so we have the very early Christian testimony that we already have in Paul. Jesus is the Christ. He was executed on the cross. He rose again on the third day. And that's what the Christian missionaries here is telling a hypothetical, very skeptical Second Temple Jewish person who the Christian views as a potential convert. So his response is, well, you've seen visions of the risen Christ, but how do you know his body isn't lying in the grave somewhere? Well, the Christian says, some of the women who were his disciples went to his tomb and it was empty. Well, that doesn't prove anything. Maybe one of the other Christians had already moved the body. No, that wouldn't be possible because the tomb had this big rock rolled in front of it that was very, very hard to move. Well, okay, so maybe it was a whole bunch of Christians who moved the body because they could have all got together and moved the rock. Weren't there 12 of you guys? And so forth, right? Doesn't matter how many disciples there were because the Romans had posted guards, so you can see how the tale, I think, is elaborating as it's kind of building out all of the different ways. Wait a second, I thought you said this Jesus guy gave all his money to the poor. Where would he get a big tomb? Only the richest people of that have tombs, have tombs like that. And so, the tomb did belong to a rich guy, so Jesus had this rich disciple named Joseph of Arimathea, and Joseph of Arimathea gave him the tomb, and so forth. Okay. The question here. There was a rich guy, owned the tomb. That's where we got the tomb. But there was a big rock. There were Roman guards and so forth. How did the women get past the guards and roll away the rock to see the empty tomb in the first place? And so the answer is, well, that's the best part. Angels scared away the guards. Angels rolled the rock away and so forth. And so I'm just suggesting here that we had a simple story to begin with. At different times, Christians will have encountered skeptics who will make these arguments. They might have made hypothetical answers to those questions. They might have shared those over the course of generations. As they're sharing those might have been understood to be actual answers and what the way things actually were, until by the time we actually get a written passion narrative 40 years later, those are all understood to have actually happened as opposed to simply being inventions that are out of necessity of apologetic argument. So this is happening on other fronts of the Passion story as well, not just in this case. So other apologetic evolutions, for example, in the crucifixion story, shift the blame away from the actual executioners, the Roman authorities, to the Jews, which is a very clear anachronism. So as I say, Jesus and his disciples were Jews. And it's only later when, for example, the Gospel of John is written that the Christian sect had divided from the other Second Temple Jewish sects and started to see itself as its own religion. It's only then that Christians began to redefine the other sects of Jews as different from themselves and to maybe be able to start calling them the Jews because now we are us. They've given away that identity because they've been kicked out of the synagogues and so forth. And again, it's an anachronism. Crucifixion is the way that Romans have capital punishment, not the local Jewish leaders and so forth who didn't have the authority to do that kind of executing in any event. We can hypothesize similar elaboration of visions of the risen Christ with details added of Christ eating and being touched, etc. Anyway, don't need to go through all of that detail of how we get from the original experience to what is ultimately written down. But anyway, beneath the layers of details created by apologetic elaboration of the story, we do get one of the details of the historical Jesus life for which we have a scholarly consensus. In other words, Jesus of Nazareth was executed by Roman authorities. Okay, so Jesus' baptism, Jesus' execution, and one more of these things is really the kind of topic we've been talking about tonight, which is Jesus being of Nazareth. So, the fact that Jesus' name is so closely associated, one of the major reasons it's called is Jesus of Nazareth. We'll explain a little bit about that. So Jesus, which is to say Yeshua, Jesus is our English version of the Greek version of Jesus' Aramaic name. At the time of Jesus' life, Yeshua, Jesus, was a very popular name, and many kids were given that name. It's named after Joshua of the Bible, who was a key ancient Israelite hero who has his very own book in the Hebrew Bible. That name in Hebrew it would be Yehoshua, or whatever we say Joshua in English. Like I say, it was a common name to give boys. After the Babylonian captivity, the name was frequently shortened from Yehoshua to Yeshua and also Yeshu. So after Christians come to venerate Jesus, so after that split actually does happen in the 1st century and the 2nd century, then the reorganizing rabbinical Jews, who are now opposed to the Christians, they do stop using this name, Jesus, and so then it becomes an uncommon name again because, they probably don't want to be named Jesus because these Christians are worshiping this guy named Jesus and they don't want to be associated with that. So it's sad for Joshua. He doesn't get people named after him anymore. So there are more than 20 different men in Josephus' writings who are named Yesuus, in other words, Jesus, which is the Greek version for both Jesus, Yeshua, and Joshua, Yehoshua. No wonder they shortened that to Yeshua. Anyway, in talking about James, the brother of Jesus, in a different uncontaminated passage, Josephus specifies that James is the brother of the Jesus who is called the Christ, in order to differentiate him from all those other Jesuses that he's been talking about. And so this is just something that this particular Jesus is commonly known as, something certainly that Josephus doesn't consider him to be. So Josephus is not a Christian and is not interested really in Christianity. So instead of family names, the most common identifiers for Jews in Jesus' day were patronymics. And so that's essentially being known by your say, so-and-so, son of so-and-so. And so the way you say that in Aramaic, which was the spoken language, is bar. And so Simon Bar Jonah, which is the guy who's later nicknamed Kepha or Peter, Jesus' main disciple, that means Simon, son of Jonah. And when we have names like Bartholomew, and so that actually means, the bar there is that son of, and so that means son of Ptolemy. So Jesus is very rarely identified as Bar Yusuf, which is to say, they're not calling him son of Joseph very often. And Joseph is really not part of the adult ministry narrative. So Joseph is probably understood to be out of the picture. Sometimes Mary is interacting through all these, and so sometimes he's Jesus, son of Mary. And so that's an interesting thing. Maybe the fact that there's something interesting going on about the historical Jesus is the reason he's not being called son of Joseph. Instead, the most frequent identifier for Jesus is topographic. So, in other words, of a town, of Nazareth. And so, as with Jesus' baptism by John and his crucifixion, Christians were really apologetic and embarrassed about Jesus' name, which is to say, of Nazareth, and birthplace. So, to fit Messianic prophecies, they testify that Jesus is the Christ, and they want him to fit all of the prophecies of the Messiah. They would have preferred him to be named Emmanuel of Bethlehem. Emmanuel, son of David of Bethlehem, is what they would have liked the most, rather than Jesus, son of Joseph of Nazareth. So Emmanuel, God is with us, is a prophecy. He'd be born in Bethlehem is a prophecy that he's going to be son of David of the house of David and so forth, as opposed to this Joseph guy. So where do these prophecies come from? So Messianism, the idea of that there's going to be a Messianic Savior, is the thing that develops during the Second Temple period. So the destruction of the First Temple and the Kingdom of Judah in 587 BC, followed by the loss of the Davidic line, the line of the kings of Jerusalem, after Zerubbabel returned with the exiles, but then presumably fell out of favor with the Persian emperor and disappeared from history, means that actually many biblical prophecies, if read literally, are failed prophecies. So the prophecy says that the scepter is never going to fall from the hands of the house of David, that David's kingdom will last forever, and so forth. That did not happen literally. That literally didn't, as the opposite happened. It got destroyed, actually. And so, oftentimes what happens when prophecies fail is that they are reinterpreted spiritually, and in this case, in conjunction with Babylonian and also Persian, Zoroastrian ideas of Armageddon and world saviors, the end of the world, and so forth. In the Second Temple period, these develop into the concept of a messianic Savior, which is pretty central to a lot of the sects of Second Temple Judaism, not so much the Sadducees, but the other ones are interested in that, including the Essenes, the Dead Sea Scroll guys. So the words then of the ancient prophets that are active even before the fall of the northern kingdom even, are then reinterpreted. So for example, Micah, who's one of the earliest prophets, the root of whose writing survive, although his text has been added to and so forth, he was active before the fall of the northern kingdom, the more important kingdom of Israel, in 722 BC to the Assyrians. And so those were there, and they're commonly reinterpreted to refer now in the Second Temple period to the coming Messiah. He writes, "But you, Bethlehem Ephrathah, though you are small among the clans of Judah, out of you will come for me one who will be ruler over Israel, whose origins are of old from ancient times." So this is a well-known prophecy, messianic prophecy, that was commonly interpreted to mean that the Messiah is going to be born in Bethlehem, not Nazareth, or anywhere else even. So what's the response of the evangelists? So the evangelists know that Jesus is commonly understood to be of Nazareth. That's what his name is. The earliest narrative gospel pretty much just concedes that Jesus is from Nazareth and maybe may not even be aware of the Micah prophecy. The text of John also seems to assume that Jesus is simply from Nazareth, although as we saw really the very back at the beginning of this lecture at the very first slide, it includes what I think of as an apologetic conversation where Nathanael asks, can anything good, come from Nazareth? Nazareth? How's this guy from Nazareth? That's not where I expect a Messiah to be from. But the other evangelists went a little further. So Mark's text, as we see, often doesn't sit well with either the author of Matthew or Luke, which is why they edited, fixed, changed, expanded, and wrote their own Gospels. Both of these writers are also better versed in Greek, and they also have read the Scriptures and know the Scriptures a little bit more. And they both apparently believed that no matter how much Jesus was of Nazareth, he must have been born in Bethlehem. So how do they get there, and how do they fill in the blanks? So since Mark's story begins with the baptism of Jesus, the text actually provides no information about Jesus' birth or childhood. To fill in the blanks, the authors of Matthew and Luke felt free to mine a different source, the Hebrew Bible itself, so the Old Testament, the Septuagint, the Greek version of the Hebrew Bible. So Christians had at the bedrock of their faith, they don't know too much about Jesus by this time anymore, but what they did know from Paul is that he had lived in accordance with Scriptures. So before any of the Gospels were written, Paul, the first Christian, as we see, whose writings survived, recorded his take on the good news drawn from Jesus' life, which is, he says in the letter to Corinthians, 1 Corinthians 15, I handed on to you as of first importance what I in turn had received, that Christ died for our sins in accordance with the Scriptures, that he was buried and was raised on the third day in accordance with our Scriptures. And elsewhere he said that he lived in accordance with our Scriptures. And so because the evangelists were all confident that Jesus had lived in accordance with the Scriptures, that's already something that's already a given, then they have no trouble, if they didn't have the details of how Jesus lived, they have no trouble looking to the Scriptures to say, oh, well, how did he live? Well, it says here that the Messiah is going to have done this. That means Jesus must have done that. So because they have that as an honest conviction, the fact that they use that to fill in details that they understood already exist is not really fraud, the way we would understand. A lot of people would say, well, they're writing fiction. This is a made-up thing. On the other hand, even though I would argue that this is done earnestly based on a belief that they had, and in any event, almost all of these writings are not historical. This is not, we need to get away from our fetishism about historicity and things like that in modern times. But in any event, the Christian claims, modern Christian claims, that the events of Jesus' life are predicted by the Old Testament. In other words, they'll read the Old Testament and there'll be a prophecy, and then they'll see that Jesus did that. Well, that does not actually offer proof at all that Jesus, the historical Jesus, certainly that Jesus was the Messiah, because the events listed here are not actually historical. They are based on the text being here. So just to center us here, this is the kind of timeline of the life of the historical Jesus between the death of Herod the Great, Pontius Pilate's governorship, and just the tiny parts of his life that are narrated in the Gospels, which are not biographies. They are theological accounts with their own theological agendas. Pretty much they all focus on the main couple years, 3 years of Jesus' life where he's active in doing so. And then Luke and Matthew, as we'll see, add a couple other little incidents at the beginning of Jesus' life. So Matthew creates a Christmas story. In Matthew's story, Joseph and his fiancée Mary already live in Bethlehem. That's where they're from. When Mary conceives a child from the Holy Spirit, an angel tells Joseph not to divorce her. Magi, or Persians or Assyrian astrologers, appear in order to, in response to a star. King Herod attempts to kill all of his potential rivals. So in other words, he hears that there's a new king of the Jews that has been born. So he wants to kill all of the babies, causing Joseph and Mary to flee from their hometown of Bethlehem to Egypt. And then when Herod dies, the family hears that his bad son is ruling in Jerusalem still, in Bethlehem, and so they decide to move to Galilee, to Nazareth, where a different son, who I guess is less bad, is ruling, where Herod Antipas is ruling. And so the idea here is that we have a birth in Bethlehem because of Matthew's story, and then we get the family ultimately to Nazareth so that Jesus can be of Nazareth. And the star, the Magi, Herod's massacre, those are things that all exist only in the Matthew story. No multiple attestation in those things. Likewise, Luke provides a longer but totally different Christmas story, beginning with the birth of John the Baptist to Zechariah and Elizabeth, who is now said to be a relative of Mary. So Mary and her fiancé Joseph already live in Nazareth in Luke's story when an angel tells her that she will give birth to the Messiah, and during her pregnancy, Joseph and Mary travel to Bethlehem in response to a very curious census decree, curious in the sense of how it's expressed anyway in the Lucan story. In Luke's story, then, there's no room at the inn, leading the baby to be born and rested in sleeping in a manger. Rather than attracting the attention of magi and kings, the angels appear to shepherds who in Luke visit the newborn baby. Later, Jesus is presented at the temple where the prophets declare him to be the Messiah, and then the family goes home to Nazareth, where they were already from in this case, and thus Jesus is born, en route as trying to think what an anchor baby, So the family moves to a place, gives birth to him, but anyway, in this case, they bring him back. So they go back to Nazareth. So different ways that they're able to accomplish an apologetic elaboration of essentially a need. So the prophecy is that Jesus, the Messiah, is supposed to be born in Bethlehem, but he's from Nazareth. So, like I say, for Christians in worship, the sacred stories are synthesized, and new apologists create traditions that reconcile them. We do that, frankly, traditionally when I was growing up. This is a picture of us in 1973. I'm there, age 3, with the little baby Jesus. I'm not Joseph, I'm the little drummer boy there. My grandpa Hamer is Joseph, and my sister is Mary. Anyway, we would read the Christmas story by jumping back and forth between Matthew and Luke so that we could put it together ourselves. However, if we're reading it honestly, as reading each individual gospel as they're meant to be written, they were not meant to be put together into one book. They each were written as standalone books. The contradictions and minor agreements that occur really give insight for us into the creative processes of the different evangelists. So we can see what Matthew is concerned, the author of Matthew is concerned about, and what the author of Luke is concerned about between these two. So one thing that just is really obvious is Matthew was interested in showing the importance of Jesus politically. So kings and magi and so forth are declaring that. The author of Matthew here is consciously just continuously ticking off all the prophecies that he's saying that Jesus' life is fulfilling. Luke, by contrast, is more spiritual. It is a more inclusive gospel about the poor and all the people, and so there's shepherds, and the poor are the ones that are attending, and it's a humble birth in a stable and so forth. And also, one of the things that's happening is there's so much more emphasis on women's issues in Luke that we're seeing. So there's female characters, a focus on Mary. There's his cousin Elizabeth that's introduced. The prophetess Anna is in there. So in other words, there's all of Luke's interest in women, where we've had a whole lecture before on was the author of Luke a woman, and each of those two little stories give us kind of those insights into the editorial and creative processes of those two evangelists. They also have to respond to the apologetic of Jesus as being from the house of David. And so I mentioned that the house of David disappears from the biblical account shortly after the exiles return from Babylon. And so that last Davidic princeling, Zerubbabel, who is appointed as a Persian official but then disappears from the record, that means that at that point the house of David is lost. And so later the Maccabees have no connection at all to the what would be the biblically legitimate house or ruling house of Israel or of Judah. So both Matthew and Luke provide Bible-style genealogies, so that kind of begat lists, for Jesus in order to make him a descendant of King David, in order to fulfill scriptures. So the scriptures say he must have been. They don't have the details or the names for it, so they provide the names or make up the names in order to fill them in. So because, like I say, the authors of Matthew and Luke believed Jesus' life fulfilled prophecy, they believed he's a descendant of David, they lacked the documentation, but they felt qualified to create non-historical genealogies, like I say, based on the beget lists. And so Matthew creates one that's only 27 generations long to get from David to Jesus. The white bolder names here are the names that are actually biblical names. And so where Matthew is following Old Testament lists of genealogies that exist in the Old Testament, although Matthew has actually dropped 4 names out. So he's actually busily editing names off this list and making it not accurate to his own from his own source, because he wants to have a symbolic number of names. Meanwhile, you can see both of them include this mysterious figure Zerubbabel. But meanwhile, Luke estimates that there's more generations that have gone by, so that this is a longer time period between David and Joseph, and creates a bunch more names in between to fill it in. So, what can we conclude? So the evangelists are not historians. Their theological understanding of Jesus as living out Scripture gave them, in their own minds anyway, license to create their sacred stories using Scripture as a source. And they might have been relying again on all kinds of their own Matthewan and Lucan traditions from their own communities, where people speaking in the Spirit had already been telling those stories, which might have originated just as ideas or as visions of the risen Christ, or speaking out of the Spirit, but then as it got retold, it became more a concretized. And so when we tell these things in the course of an even short lecture as a split-second process, it seems like night and day, you're just making something up. But there's a long evolutionary process sometimes in these. So historians agree that the nativity stories are the inventions of the evangelists. They don't represent anything that happened in the historical Jesus. I think that's pretty much universal from even the most conservative scholars that are actually scholars. And so if they're past that and saying that these were historical, that's where they're on the other side of the line of scholar. So it brings us a little back here. So we just think about Galilee as we're concluding here. So while the evangelists and other early Christians may have wanted Christ to be from Bethlehem in Judea, since that would have fulfilled the prophecy better, I think it's actually kind of interesting that the actual historical Jesus was from Nazareth in Galilee, for kind of all the reasons that we talked about Galilee's different history and its different tradition and so forth, not being at the center and the heart of the tradition. Galilee here is a diverse place, has a mixture of languages and religion. The local roots of Jewish practice are far less established than they were in Judea around Jerusalem. The Jewish settlement there that has happened, and the conversions of the local peoples there at the time of the Maccabees, those people are separated, although they have a big kind of colony or community. They're separated from Jerusalem, from Samaria on the one hand, where the Samaritans are, and these great rivals who have their own different competing partisan interpretation of the true Israelite religion. And on the other hand, this area Decapolis, which is to say the local peoples who have all Hellenized and have decided, no, we're going to live these cosmopolitan Greek ideas and Greek understandings. And so they're very much isolated from the center, even though they're really only, not that far away from it. You have to go through anyway these other peoples to get there. So given that locale, it may be that separateness, that difference of context may have given Jesus and the members of his movement a lot more cultural license to be creative. They didn't have some of the same really fixed traditions that were immediate and right there in front of them that were maybe gluing them to a more conservative practice. And instead they could discern like what really matters most to them about their faith tradition. And they could explore, even though we have, we're going to continue to do this or that observance and on this same understanding of God and so forth, nevertheless, we maybe don't like some of these purity obligations that are forcing certain members of our community to be excluded or marginalized and so forth. We want to, one of their major issues was bringing into the congregation, into the synagogue, people who were not allowed to be there according to the purity laws and so forth. And so it's interesting anyway that this particular sect of Judaism that ultimately becomes or inspires Christianity emerged in this unlikely and very unexpected place. And so those are my thoughts about why Jesus was from Galilee, even though nobody expected him to be. And so we'll see what you guys have been thinking, and as Leandro has.
So just make sure that everyone knows to ask questions.
Yeah, go ahead and ask questions so we can continue the conversation. So I want to thank people for supporting the channel. So I want to thank Rob Wood, Dan Howard, Esteban Lopez, Leon Berg, Andrew Suriali. So boy, thank you so much. It really helps us in order to continue to devote a lot of time and resources in order to make these lectures, which we think are really valuable, and we think they're really a vital resource. So thank you. Michacho writes, which historian theologian would you recommend reading for somebody looking into how Jesus has been represented as a radical figure? So there, I was going to have a slide about this, about the different ways of
Everyone saying Reza Aslan.
yeah. So Reza Aslan is, so everybody said that, and that is a one kind of radical. So right, so Reza Aslan has a book called Zealot, and so he is making the contention of saying that Jesus is like one of the other sects of contemporary Judaism that Josephus talks about. So it's not the big three that Josephus talks about. It's another one called the Zealots, who were militant, and there's even a figure in the Gospels that has the epithet, the Zealot. So in other words, the Gospels are also aware of the background of some Zealots and some Zealots as being part of the Christian movement. One of the problems, I think, with Reza Aslan's study is that he's coming from outside the long tradition that I think there's a lot of work on that has been done on the historical Jesus, and so it's more of a popular book than one that is deeply grounded. One of the quotes that he relies pretty heavily on is from the Gospel of Matthew, where Jesus says, "I don't come to bring peace, but a sword," and that's problematic for a couple reasons. One, there's no multiple attestation there, so that's the Matthew only verse. So you don't want to have that pin your whole historical Jesus on something that doesn't have multiple attestation. And in any event, the symbolism within Christian writings of the sword is very clearly that the sword is the word. Even in the visions of the apocalypse, people misinterpret the apocalypse, the battle, as being nuclear war or something, in the crazy modern false misinterpretation of the book. But the battle is taking place where the sword issues out from the mouth. It's because the sword is the word, it's the gospel. And so it is divisive, but it's not because of a armed insurrection or zealotry. But Jesus is a radical figure in a bunch of other ways. And so another great historian of the historical Jesus is John Dominic Crossan. And so I would read him to talk about Jesus as radical social reformer, somebody who is talking about ending unjust systems that are oppressing the people in Galilee, the local Galileans. So Jesus is in this context of, he's not an elite person. He's coming out of being a woodsmith family. And so that is, the local artisan class is essentially drawn from the same ranks as the peasantry. And so there's even a bunch of richer peasants who have land and things like that than the local artisans. Essentially, if an artisan family is going to come from, let's say, a lesser son that doesn't have any land, and instead a father who's passing land on to, a next son will have his second son, he'll set him up in a trade, like a woodsmith or something like that. And so what ends up happening is people in the peasant and artisan class, this kind of common class that Jesus is in Galilee, they're losing their shirts over things like anytime the government is interacting with them, the Romans are forcing them to provide service in order to help the troops march this and there. The court fees are exorbitant. They are heavily taxed, even though they aren't feeling that they're seeing much results from that. And so one of Jesus's ideas here is we need to stop focusing on property and things like that, and instead focus on and what matters to Caesar's money and that kind of a thing, and we need to be thinking about things that are eternal and valuable. So that would be a good one to read too. So John Dominic Crossan, I really like him. So Andrew Suriali says, what is your opinion of the suggestion that some Christian sayings of Jesus sound Hellenistic? They are historical. As a Galilean living right next to Sepphoris, he would have known Greeks. Yeah, so he would have known Greeks. There's no doubt. Jesus talks to Greek-speaking people in the Gospels. That's not necessarily historical, but he was living right next to. That's also happening in the texts themselves, but he also would have been, like you say, a person who is from a little town that is right next to Sepphoris. The leaders speak Greek, so he will have heard some Greek. So generally speaking, what you say, let's say if his dad is running or stepdad, whatever you want to call Joseph, the family is running a woodsmithing business or something like that, they may well know enough Greek in order to have receipts and things like that, even if they're not literate. So the saying sound Hellenistic. The reality is that the area has been part of a Hellenistic kingdom and culture for, at this point, 360 years. That's plenty of time if you think of how much Canada has changed in the last 360 years, let's say. So 360 years, plenty of time to have some Greek ideas seep into the place, and especially considering it's being actively ladled on people at a certain point. So it's not it's no surprise at all that Greek ideas are present here in the area that Jesus is. Like we say, Galilee is a very mixed place, and there are Greek cosmopolitan centers right next door. Matthias says, did the French and British use biblical ideas of geography when carving Israel-Palestine out of Ottoman Syria? Well, they had a crazy map. So when during World War I, the British and French got out a map of the Middle East which had been all under, like you say, Ottoman Turkish dominion. And there was 2 bureaucrats, one from each empire, Sykes and Picot. And so they started drawing on the map, and they created the Sykes-Picot Agreement. And as usual, like the British, always kind of, or they're always more interested in practical things, like they want all the oil that's in Iraq. And then the French are kind of interested, seems like anyway, in having honor and a big, nice space. They want to have a really grand Syria, and so they wanted to make their component of the mandate that they're carving up out of the Ottoman Empire really big, and so they're, the British are going to get Iraq, and the French are going to get Syria, but it's a great Syria, so they wanted to include Lebanon and a whole bunch of Kurdistan and so forth. Although then they proceeded to carve it up themselves. I don't think that they are using biblical maps. I mean, British also are going to get Palestine and Transjordan. And I don't think that they're actually using that because the biblical map, the tribes would include a bunch of Transjordan. And so, when they're creating the Palestine mandate, it's, I think, all on the west side of the Jordan. And so that would cut off the tribes of half Manasseh and Gad. Gilead was all over on the other side. So if they were trying to just like fill it out to be the area of the 12 tribes as described in the gospel, it doesn't quite work because they're missing parts of the east bank of the Jordan, and then they're also adding onto it like this whole region of Edom, so the Negev, the desert that takes it all the way down to Aqaba, or next to Aqaba. Aqaba's in Arabia, but Elat, whatever it is, whatever the Israeli port is at the bottom of there next to Aqaba. And so essentially, I think that they're thinking in terms of like as military men or in terms of bureaucrats, because they're going to a gulf in a straight line. They're going from a straight line to the Dead Sea, and then they're taking using the natural boundary of the Jordan River, and then they're taking a little bit on top. So, Donnie Lee Gringo says the Gospels mention a synagogue in Nazareth. This is confirmed with other sources. So there is later a synagogue that we have remains of. I don't think that it dates to Jesus' time, so it's built a little later. So one of the things that is happening is that by the time the Gospels are written, then there's a synagogue in Nazareth that's an actual physical building. But that doesn't mean that there's... So the idea of synagogues, the idea of congregations of Jews is very much in flux in the late Second Temple period. And so it could very well be that there is a congregation, a synagogue of Jews that is not a building necessarily, and so it's hard to say. So sort of yes, sort of no. That's what I would say about that. It's one of the ideas that it's an interesting thing, but it's kind of, we have to date all of those kind of things to when the gospel was written. So if that's talking about in Mark is aware that there are synagogues around the year 70, and it isn't really evidence for the year 30. The great shaming of being said, did Judas betray Jesus because he was the only Judean in a group of Galileans? I have never heard that before. So here's the problem with being able to, we had a whole lecture on the 12 apostles. The whole problem with it is that we don't actually have, most of the apostles are just names. And so, and they're not even consistent. And so the gospel writers are filling out a list at a certain point. So there's only a kind of a core set of half the apostles that we have even any serious traditions about that date back to the gospel tradition. There's later traditions that people elaborate for everyone. Those are all made up. But the earlier parts and their backgrounds we don't really know, and so I think we can't say that for sure that would be the case. But that's an interesting idea. I like that. Ray Ashima says, what do you think of Margaret Baker's idea that there is a residual belief of El and Asherah in Galilee, which she then elaborates as an explanation for a later idea of Trinity. So the idea here is that it's an interesting idea. I think that's very interesting. So, like I said, there could well be. So we did a little short, kind of a thumbnail history of Galilee, right? So until the time period when the Maccabees conquer the place, that area will never have been what we might think of as Jewish in the later sense, because Jewish is coming out of Judah, and the Judah kingdom exiles and return, really. It will have been Israelite, but the Israelite religion, even though it is also becoming, it's doing the same thing that the later Jewish continuance has in the Second Temple. The Israelite religion in the northern kingdom, may not be anywhere near as far along in terms of centralizing, and so there may well have been like a lot more ongoing, probably throughout the entire northern kingdom, as long as it existed, ongoing worship of El, which is to say the head of the pantheon, the sky creator god above Yahweh, and then also Asherah, the consort, the queen of heaven, which is, because we know that all the way up actually long after the destruction of the northern kingdom, Jeremiah is complaining that the Judeans are still busy with Asherah and so forth. He can't get the women to stop baking cakes for the queen of heaven and so forth. So the Galileans, there's no reason to imagine that had gotten stamped out of them before the Assyrians destroyed their kingdom and took their elites away and let the local peasants do what they want, which is probably continue to worship El and Asherah, and so then as they later have, it depopulates a bit, and as they later have other peoples who are polytheists, who may have, still be Canaanites. So these are broadly understood. El and Asherah are going to be within the broader Canaanite pantheon tradition anyway. So those could have also continued. And so in other words, I think that there's no problem to imagine that lots of those kinds of, we might think of as Canaanite, Syro-Phoenician paganism is still live and well in Jesus' day in Galilee. Does that influence, though, why we have Father, Son, and Holy Spirit? I don't know about that, because I don't know that we have Son coming out of the Galilean context. So I think that having Son is coming out of the Christian context, which is when people in the Paul's Greek congregations are trying to figure out the relationship between Christ and the one God, right? And so I don't know if I see it as a connection, but I do think it's interesting. Yeah. Well, Leandro reminds me that Baal is also a son of El, but yes, of course. But that doesn't mean that this is where the Christians are worrying about sons. So, like I'm saying, I think that that's coming from the later Christological problem as a source. So Daryl Scott says, what was Micah's Bethlehem prophecy originally intended to mean? So it would have been referring to a literal king. So it's like the Isaiah prophecy, which says, which is about the virgin birth, the way it gets translated into the Septuagint again. So, a virgin shall conceive and bear a son, and you shall call him Emmanuel, which his name means God with us, and so forth. He's just referring to the king. It's not a virgin; it's a young woman, is what it means in the original Hebrew, and he's just kind of he's prophesying that the king, a regular human king of Judah, is going to marry a young wife. They're polygamous, and so he'll have one of his young wives. A young woman will give birth, and they're going to have a prince, and that prince is going to be able to be in favor of the the Yahwist monolateral religion that we're trying to have, instead of all of the bad sons, the bad princes that are constantly bringing back, all of the polytheist Canaanite practices that we don't like. And so essentially these are literal prophecies that are talking about the actual kings and what their royal families, and so that they'll have actual sons who are going to do those things. Matthias says, was Samaria ruled by a Samaritan tetrarch? Did they participate in the Jewish revolt against the Romans? So no, it wasn't. So what happened was the Hasmoneans conquered Samaria. The Herod the Great went to the Roman Senate and was able to get them to make Samaria and Galilee and Idumea and Judea and so forth, all those areas, into his kingdom. And so he was ruling it. And so then when Galilee and Perea are ruled by a Herodian tetrarch, the area of Samaria and Judea and Idumea, so Samaria, is not ruled by a Samaritan tetrarch. The Romans originally give it to one of Herod's sons, then they get rid of him, and then the Romans just incorporate it as its own kind of province. They rule it directly. So Samaria is ruled by Pontius Pilate at the time of Jesus. Did they participate in the Jewish revolt? So they didn't. There's several revolts, and so they didn't participate in the Jewish revolts. They did have their own revolt, though, later against the Romans, and they were really destroyed, too. So they're on their own team. Let Something Shine says, does Honi the circle drawer relate to the word Galilee coming from a similar word meaning circle? So a lot of times I would suggest that that's probably it could be, I don't know the exact etymology of Galilee, but I think it's probably a false etymology if so, but I don't know. We'd have to look at that up. I can't tell you for offhand. I won't be able to answer that one. Lisa Ruggiero says, what are your thoughts about Mary, mother of Jesus? I have so many questions, such as one quote, son of Mary, was Mary's family ranked higher ranked, and was she possibly disowned? So yeah, there's different options there. And we don't know. I don't know which one I like the most. So the one is that when we get past the nativity narratives that include Joseph is never around in any of the other narratives, and so we know the nativity narratives are not historical. Mary is better attested, and the presence of Mary's mother, whether she's named or not, she's not named in the Gospel of John, is much greater, and so we have a sense that Jesus has a mom, and she's around during the main time of his ministry and after his death even. And interestingly, there's some criteria of embarrassment or whatever if she was seen as a leader of the church. That's not how she's portrayed in Mark's gospel, because in Mark's gospel she and her other children, Jesus' brothers, think that Jesus has gone crazy, and they try to stop him from preaching and doing his ministry and all those sorts of things. So as far as Mark is concerned, Jesus' family is antagonistic to the movement. So anyway, so it is very interesting. There's a lot of questions about the historical Mary, and so we should probably do a whole lecture on the historical Mary. We've had who was Mary Magdalene, but we should have who was Mary, the mother of Jesus. So that's very good. Matthias, thank you for your support. Tristan Turner says, is there any extra biblical historical evidence for the supposed census in the Roman Empire as seen in well, you're saying in Matthew, but it's in Luke, right? And so there went out a decree from Caesar Augustus that all the world should be taxed. So there is a census that happens. So there's a bunch of, so people have identified when this is supposed to be or what Luke is kind of referencing and that kind of a thing. The problem here is not whether the Romans take censuses. The problem is the response of Jesus' family, the Joseph and Mary anyway, when they, to this census, which is something that no one has ever done this, no census has ever occurred like this. What is a census for? So we take censuses in modern times because we have all these statistical needs and you want to be able to allocate welfare and other things. You want people to be able to vote and so forth. In the Roman times, you have a census so that people can be taxed. The reason why the census in Norman England is called the Doomsday Book is you don't want to have a census. It means you're going to get taxed, and they don't make everybody go some weird place to have a census. They want to know where you are right now, how much money you have, how much money you're making, and where they can come to find you so that they can get taxes from you. So it's not that there's no census or anything like that, but there is no way that the response that Luke creates, that the couple would go to Bethlehem in response to a census, that doesn't make any sense. And if he's from there, if Joseph is from there, why do they have to try to stay in an inn? Why wouldn't he have all kinds of relatives living there? It doesn't make any sense. It doesn't matter. That's not what Luke is trying to do. So it's not historical. Theophilus says, was Yehuda bar Shimeon ish Korea, which is to say Judas, son of Simon, the man who hands out. It was later changed to, was it later changed to Ish Cariota, the man who handed over, betrayed? Oh, so yeah, so we have, you're talking about here essentially this character of Judas Iscariot, as we call him. So is that one of these things where there would have been a pun, where Iscariot is a pun in order to make it be, like you say, the man who handed him over, the man who betrayed him. That's possible. That could be where that's derived from. I don't know that. I have not heard that read before. That's a very interesting idea. But I mean, those kinds of epithets happen a lot biblically, and so I mean that wouldn't be inconceivable to me. I think that's interesting. I haven't heard that before. Okay, is there more? Oh, Matt Leander's sending one more to me. Oh, yeah. Michael Rogers asks, is there any evidence of unorthodox early Christian practices that merged with pagan practices? And the example Michael gives is psychedelic Eucharist discussed in the Immortality Key or later practices that developed. So I don't think that there's any reason at all to imagine anything about psychedelic Eucharist. So I don't see that. I know that people are especially excited about finding ancient uses of psychedelics and other things because people are especially excited about them right now in our present day context, and our present day context always informs our reading of the past. There's all kinds of unorthodox pagan practices that got merged into Christianity, yes. So, there would just be, we were going to have a lecture. One of the people we asked for lecture topics, and somebody was asking, how did early Christians start venerating saints? There's, we've had lectures about how does pagan holidays like Christmas become a Christian holiday and so forth. So there are those are just big ones, but there's all kinds of unorthodox practices that do that. But I'm dubious about all of the new excitement about reading psychedelics into the past. I feel like in this case, the symbolism of the shared meal is actually, it seems to be pretty clearly coming out of the actual practice of eating a meal together, and it just is getting curtailed down not from psychedelic vision, but from eating a bunch of bread together and drinking wine together down to just a symbolic version of it. Michelangelo, oh, thank you for your support. John Rishi, I've heard some theologians state that Jesus was illiterate, they couldn't read or write. I find that difficult to believe since he read the Torah and because of his obvious wisdom. My opinion, so again, when we're talking about like this thing, so there's an account in Luke where he comes and he reads, maybe in all the synoptics, where he reads from the Torah, a very place in the scroll where he's reading from Isaiah, things that he's identifying as his mission in the synagogue that Donnie Lee Gringo was mentioning. So is that a historical thing, though? So we're not sure that there was a synagogue. You know, there's later a synagogue. We're not sure that that is a practice that was happening. We don't know for sure that Jesus was doing that. The answer is we don't know for sure. You can make the argument both cases that, so that you can argue that that's not a historical incident, that that's an invention of the evangelists, and that we don't have a lot of other evidence, maybe, that Jesus is writing. He could have learned lots through, listening to oral tradition, and we also have no writings from him, right? So he didn't write any books, and we have no writings from his immediate disciples. We have no writings in his native language that he was actually preaching in Aramaic. We only have when they started converting Greek-speaking people, they wrote things down in Greek, and so they had the oral tradition of the sayings and so forth. They translated them into the Greek context, and then they wrote them down. So he's from a poor background. Almost nobody in his community would be literate. That doesn't mean that he's illiterate for sure, though. We can't say that for sure, but that's why that argument is made. So, I want to thank Michael Rogers for your support. There's one closing question from Leon Berg. Being from Galilee, did Jesus know how to swim, even though he could walk on water? Haha, okay. So we don't have any examples, I think, of Jesus swimming. It's hard to know if Jesus knows how to swim. It doesn't have to, though, as you say, Leon, because he can walk right on top. Thank you all so much. We are having a lecture next week. I will announce what it is about, hopefully, before next week. Bye-bye.